A while back, you asked me to rip my brain asunder and drag more knowledge about battery cells from my neural sponge. Well, after reading and digesting another paper about batteries, I assume this is because you love me so, and not because you're wanting to have the civet coffee equivalent of knowledge. In this case, it's also because quite a while ago now we covered an interesting paper in the Journal of the Electrochemical Society on the issue of battery degradation in monocrystalline versus polycrystalline cells. If you're already having a bit of an episode of degradation yourself, don't worry. I'm going to explain what those are, or at least I'm going to try to, and then we're going to talk about what this study says in terms of battery degradation. And then next week, I'm going to try and work on the sodium batteries paper, because you all asked about that too. This is because you love me, right? Not because you want to cause me pain and torment by making my poor little neural sponge hurt? Okay, just, checking. For those of you wanting to read along at home, today's paper is The Complex and Spatially Heterogeneous Nature of Degradation in Heavily Cycled Lithium-Ion Cells by Bond, Gauthier et al. In this case, the specifics of the et al. Are kinda important because they include Professor Jeff Dunn, a professor of physics and atmospheric science at Dalhousie University. Dunn and the Jeff Dunn research group have been incredibly influential in research regarding EV battery technology. He's worked both on EV and fuel cell technologies, and most recently, his teaching position at Dalhousie ran concurrently with positions as an industrial research chair at the NSERC, that's the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council of Canada, and at Tesla Canada. Alright, so the first question that I think we need to address is what are mono and polycrystalline cells? If you're a big fan of the abundant, cheap supply of electricity that comes from solar energy, and who isn't? Well, yeah, apart from that orange grifter. Anyway, moving on, then you may be familiar with the terms from polycrystalline and monocrystalline solar panels. So before we talk about batteries, we're going to talk about solar panels, because they're things people actually kinda know about. Huzzah! Yes, I pulled a little switcheroo. You thought you were going to talk about batteries, but no. We're going to talk about solar panels first, briefly. Because, well, if you understand the concepts involved with solar panel construction, you can apply that to batteries too. Monocrystalline panels are made from monocrystalline cells. It's kind of hinted at in the name. Mono meaning one, so each particle in the cell is made of one single crystal with a uniform, consistent structure across the cell. Polycrystalline solar cells are each made from a multitude of particles, each of which is a multitude of different crystals kind of smooshed together. The different crystals can all be pointing in different directions or different orientations, as is the more technical term. And no, there aren't just two different orientations. But the thing about that is it's easier, much easier, to take a huge bunch of small crystals and smoosh them together than it is to make one big crystal. So polycrystalline solar cells tend to be cheaper and easier to make, but that comes at a cost. Well, it comes at several costs. The first is efficiency, which for polycrystalline solar cells tends to be around 14%, whereas monocrystalline solar cells typically sit between 15 and 20% efficient. And the second is lifespan. Now, contrary to the inane ramblings of the convicted felon in the White House and the nonsense that's been on Instatalk of late, solar panels, regardless of their mono-poly status, no judgment, have a design lifespan that's as long as Nikki and I have been unleashing our civilization-destroying notions on the world together. Which is to say, we've been friends for a quarter of a century, and that's how long solar panels are designed to last. which is not to say they stop working at that point. They just slowly lose efficiency. I've actually seen solar panels on a house in the UK that have been in operation longer than I've been despairing at the idiocy of the apes. So by 25 years, they might well be outside their manufacturer's specs for performance, but in many cases, they'll just continue to work fine. They'll be a bit less efficient though. Now, some of you might be wondering why I've been wittering about solar panels, but the thing is, the same sort of stuff applies to mono and polycrystalline lithium and probably sodium batteries. Just like their solar panel equivalents, monocrystalline battery cells are more expensive to produce than polycrystalline ones, but they have been commonly known to have an advantage in terms of their lifespan. And the question that's been bugging people for a long time is why? Now, we've known for a bit that polycrystalline battery cells tend to get microfractures, little tiny cracks that are impossible to see without expensive lab equipment. Lab equipment that makes my inner nerd go, ooh, and would you mind if I just took that outside to look at it in the light? I feel like it would go really well with my ocarina. In their cathodes. And we've known that those cracks were at least part of what ultimately led those cells to lose their peak performance. And well, because I love you all, I've dug out this lovely high magnification image from a paper called A Comparative Investigation of Single Crystal and Polycrystalline Nickel-Rich NCMs as Cathodes for Lithium-Ion Batteries. It's quite a lovely piece of reading if you're into such things. You do you, boo. And it shows a comparison between polycrystalline and monocrystalline nickel-cobalt-manganese cathodes. And here's another image, taken presumably using a scanning electron microscope, where you can see that the big blobs of polycrystalline have these little tiny microcracks in them which have formed as the battery is charged and discharged. One of these papers is almost a decade old at this point, so why are we talking about it now? Well, like I said a little while ago, we covered this paper from the Journal of the Electrochemical Society, and the reason it's interesting is not that it's groundbreaking in terms of identifying that monocrystalline cathodes are much better at resisting cracking, because we kind of knew that already. It's because, unlike the vast majority of studies that we've seen before, it uses both actual complete battery cells of the sort that are used in commercial applications, and it also uses cells that have been truly heavily cycled in a way that's much more representative of what you might see in an electric vehicle. And it also really adds depth to our knowledge of what's going on in the cell. Basically, up to this point, a lot of the science into studying this kind of thing had to effectively destroy the cells or use very special ones to examine what was going on inside. It was a little like the early days of medicine, where doctors were doing the kind of diagnosis they did after the person had expired from whatever demon had ailed them. Now, what's also interesting is that actually, at least so far as I've seen, while monocrystalline cells do have this lifespan advantage where they lose out, is that they're slightly lower capacity to start off with. So, as with many things in life, there's a trade-off between initial capacity and degradation. But that may be something that becomes less of an issue over time as we go on and we build smaller, more efficient electric... Oh. Not apparently a thing that we're doing. You say we're just going to build larger and more expensive and less efficient EVs? Oh, they're going to be super unaffordable as well. Okay, cool. A+ plan there. No notes. All right, well, that's a tomorrow cake problem, not a right now cake problem. So now we have at least a loose idea of what we're talking about. Let's dig in a bit to the why of what they were looking for and what they found. So the first point that comes up is that once EV batteries have done their jobs in cars, they really want to be reused. We've talked about this a lot on the channel, that the pearl-clutching wailing and gnashing of teeth of scientifically illiterate folk about throwing millions of Triganic pews worth of resources in the trash I'd say dollars worth, but the value of that has been so labile recently thanks to our great financial management. Well, there's that and the fact that I don't really feel like dealing with fiddly small change. That claim that it all goes to waste is stupid. Yeah, the batteries from many small appliances aggravatingly do seem to be doing that because we have no functional universal recycling system. But EV traction batteries are just worth too damn much to do that with. Also, if you just dump them in a hole in the ground, there's a non-zero chance that they'll go up in flames eventually, and we wouldn't want to do that. I mean, that could cause raging underground fires, and no industry would be so dangerous as to... Centralia, Pennsylvania? But surely the responsible fossil fuel... Well, wouldn't they just... I mean, I'm sure they're making it... Oh, just letting it burn. Fine. Well, never mind. Okay. So the thing is, modern car batteries will probably outlast the poorly built metal boxes we've put them in. That's in part because modern vehicles are huge piles of computers strung loosely together, and those bits are actually quite hard to repair. And automakers in the US in particular have become fond of jamming as many cut-price, cheaply made doodads and doohickeys in an effort to justify a sticker price somewhat north of what EVs cost in other markets. So it's quite likely that people will get sick of them once the head unit starts obnoxiously playing Never Gonna Give You Up, or perhaps due to a misused eMMC finds it can no longer write data where it needs to. But it's also because battery packs, motors and inverters last a gosh darn long time, and the suspension will still wear out, the interior will get grody, and the body will probably rust away before the batteries are actually dead. When that happens, we'd like to take those battery packs and reuse them, and having packs that have cathodes that aren't full of tiny microfractures will absolutely help in prolonging their lives. Those packs can then be used for grid stabilization and renewable energy storage, which is, to be fair, something that we're already doing. Even Nissan Leaf packs can find a new home doing that. But it's something we should be doing a lot more of. And the second thing that comes up is something I hinted at earlier. Up until now, we've seen a lot of research using batteries built for research. The cells used in a research lab are typically not the kind of batteries that you just buy off the shelf from a commodity supplier. That's for a whole bundle of reasons, but one of the most pressing of them is that it's very difficult to image what's going on inside a commercial cell. That's because the materials used to make them are often what's termed radio opaque. That means you can't see through them with an X-ray, and a large chunk of how we look at battery cells and crystals is a technique called X-ray diffraction. Another big chunk is neutron diffraction, which is a related technique. So often the batteries in studies had little beryllium windows in them so that you could shine X-rays through them and see what was going on. If you're not familiar with these types of diffraction, they're processes in which you shine a beam of X-rays or neutron rays on typically a crystal. That's what we're doing in this case. Well, in this case it's either a single crystal or a little pile of polycrystallineness. The rays are scattered and reflected by the atoms and the electrons within those crystals. By looking at the reflected pattern, which is a mixture of dark and light spots, and analysing it, you can work backwards to understand the structural arrangement of the atoms in the crystal. Now, in this study, they use synchrotron X-ray diffraction, which is essentially the same as regular X-ray diffraction, but using a super powerful X-ray. Let me be clear here that I'm simplifying this a lot. It's like being told men have XY chromosomes and women have XX chromosomes when you're at school. While that's kinda more or less true on a broad scale, there's a lot of rather important nuance and details and really factually important stuff that's been left out. And like the physics analogy of perfectly spherical cows, it's also not actually true in the real world. And my really rough and ready description of diffraction techniques is really rough and ready. Really. Just about good enough for the Portsmouth Symphonia. Another interesting thing about this study is that it examined cells during use, or in operando. And like I say, no part of this is entirely novel, but it is notable for having all these aspects combined. But most interestingly, at least to me, is that this study used cells that have been heavily cycled. Typically, cells in studies have been through a few hundred cycles, but for EVs we want them to last thousands, maybe even tens of thousands of cycles. And the polycrystalline NMC 622 cells, if you didn't remember, the numbers after NMC refers to the relative amounts of the three main defining metals in a cell, in this case nickel, manganese and cobalt, had been through 2,380 cycles, and the monocrystalline NMC 532 cells had been through 20,000 cycles. One set cycled to 100% depth of discharge and one to 50% depth of discharge. So the first, unsurprising finding is that the likely cycled cells maintained their capacity much better. This may be why my Niro EV's battery has, at least so far, remained very healthy, because my typical commute is about a fifth of my car's range, and so on the days when I do commute, it gets driven down from 90 to 70% state of charge, and then I whack it back on the charger. Please excuse me now while I go and find an entire lumberyard to touch. I'm going to pop this up on screen, and what you can see is that the capacity of the heavily cycled cell fades steadily to 76% of its original capacity after 2.5 years of cycling to 100% depth of discharge. However, the lightly cycled cell is still at 96% of its original capacity after a year of cycling to just 25% depth of discharge. The other interesting thing is that when constructed, the batteries have excess electrolyte, which, yes, we knew. But the impact of heavy cycling both on the cathode particles and the way that sucks in the electrolyte is just kind of fascinating to observe. Once there are enough microfractures to draw in more excess electrolyte than is available in the battery, then the eventual endpoint of that process is that parts of the cell dry out, and then the cell fails. And that's a process you get to see in progress here. Okay, but we said that monocrystalline cells did better, so how did that pan out? Well, the polycrystalline cells have cathode particles roughly a nanometer in diameter. That's about 1/100,000th the thickness of a piece of paper, so easy to visualize. The monocrystalline cathode has particles about 1 micrometer, or micron, that's about 1,000 nanometers, or about 1,000 times thicker than the polycrystalline particles. Yeah, alright, it's hard to visualize and hard to give you pretty pictures that show that kind of difference. Basically, one is teeny tiny and the other is just very small. How's that? Despite that massive size difference, the monocrystalline cells don't develop those microfractures in the same pernicious way. Now, it should be noted that the monocrystalline cell was cycled at lower temperatures than the polycrystalline cell, stressing the monocrystalline cell a bit less. So these things aren't exactly directly comparable. On the other hand, the upper cutoff voltage was higher in the monocrystalline cell than the polycrystalline cell, something that subjects the monocrystalline cell to more stress. And as we've noted, the poly and monocrystalline cells have slightly different chemical compositions, which could also be affecting the results. An ideal test would be one in which the cells were exactly the same except for the structure of the cathode, and the cycling temperature, voltages, depth of discharge and chemical makeup were exactly the same. However, as is noted by the study's authors, this data is drawn from cells that were actually being used in other studies. So let's throw the pretty graphs up on screen and chat about them for a moment. The first thing that's really obvious is how quickly the capacity falls in the polycrystalline cell, the blue line compared to the monocrystalline cell, the orange line. What's also interesting is how quickly the delta V, which is effectively the internal resistance of the cell, goes up for the polycrystalline cells. Now, this all may look bad for the polycrystalline cells, and it is definitely suggestive of monocrystalline cells being much more resilient. It should also be noted that the authors identify that if the cells were part of a typical-ish modern EV with a range of 250 miles or 400 kilometers, the monocrystalline and still healthy-ish cells would have traveled around 5 million miles, or around 8 million kilometers. And the polycrystalline cell would have traveled around 592,000 miles, or around 952,000 kilometers. Alicus Agonis would be happy with that kind of longevity. I mean, he'd be deeply upset by the fripperies. Cars have heaters now. How utterly ridiculous. And the fact that women have the gall to go around driving vehicles, I mean, that's just disgraceful. But he would like the lifespan of the batteries. So, by that point, most EVs are going to be, well, tired. Because as I mentioned earlier, while an EV's transmission may only have a few moving parts, you'll still have the wear and tear on the suspension, to some extent on the brakes, but also on stupid things like door latches and window winders. The thing that actually prompted my mum's switch to an EV was that the central locking broke on her 15-year-old car. Having just repaired the brakes and something else, which I can't remember what it was, she decided that rather than get yet another electronic thing fixed, despite loving her Skoda, she would instead get herself into a shiny, newer, electrically motived thing. Anyhow, final picture in today's show and tell is the control cell versus the cycled cell, comparing the single and polycrystalline cells. The reason I'm showing you this is the one other thing that the authors noted. They could only scan a tiny proportion of the cell's entire structure, but even within that small area they noted that it's not uniform. The degradation impacts are highly variable. The authors are very keen to urge more study, looking at time and space modelling of what's going on in cells so we can better understand battery degradation, because this tiny snapshot, where you can look at the cell and try and make generalizations, but without more data, they might well be wrong. But it does seem like the other message is pretty simple and pretty clear. If you want your cells to last a long time, just be nice to them.
Thanks for joining us today, and if you've got thoughts, make sure you leave them in our Discord room, on our Patreon page, down below, or you can reach us on Mastodon or Blue Sky. Thanks to the amazing list of people scrolling by on your screen right now. They're part of the massive community of supporters who make this channel possible, helping us through Patreon and YouTube, covering our bills, paying our team, and helping us to remain 100% independent. If you'd like to join them and see your name listed here, follow the links below. We've got options available across a range of different price points from $1.50 US a month. A massive welcome to our newest supporters: Dan Fitzsimmons, Yanni Mavrophilippos, MB, Bryce McKean, Nimter, Calvin Climey, Marek Kowalski, Dave Nelson, Chip Chandler, Ed Zavada, Alan Bussell, Tully, Robert Blackman, Kristinan Rasmussen, Michelle Brennan, Scott Webber, Dal Sam, Bob Harry Lamb, Jeff Curtis, William Radka, SDS, Barry T, Trikant Chowdhury, Ernest Bryce, Matthew, Bill, and Spinks Garden. To join the list and get your shout out, become a paid Patreon member for your moment of fame and me mispronouncing your name. And you can even gift memberships to someone else. If you'd like to support us with a one-off donation, you'll find links below to make Ko-fi and Bitcoin donations, and we even have an old-fashioned PO box you can reach us at for the time being, addressed below. You'll also find links to our swag store, and if you're someone who has to shop on Amazon, please consider using our affiliate link so we get commission, not Jeff Bezos. So we can continue to focus on making our content even better and reduce burnout, we're being a little freer with our release days, but plan on dropping new content every Tuesday, Thursday and Saturday on our main channel, plus something on Sunday over on TE Take 2. If you want more, the algorithm that hates us thinks you should be watching this video, but this video is one we'd like you to check out. Be awesome, be kind, be intentional, and don't forget to resist. Keep evolving!